On the surface, it's just a soda pop. A cold drink you can buy almost anywhere. But it's come to be more than that. How did this soft drink, Coca-Cola, become an emotional touchstone for millions around the globe? Trace that story, and you trace a small part of the world's story.
Well, I think Coke's great success over the years was in ingratiating itself into every change of society.
I've often said to friends of mine that I could probably teach a course in American social history and use nothing but advertising for Coca-Cola.
During the Depression, you could always call a fella and say, "Larry, meet me down for Coca-Cola. I want to buy you a Coca-Cola."
It brought with it the effervescence of American society in the effervescence of its drink.
If you're having a bad time, if the country's having a bad time, if the world's having a bad time, it's okay because there's still Coke.
(1886) was a good year for cultural icons. The Statue of Liberty was unveiled to great fanfare in New York Harbour. In London, Sherlock Holmes first stalked the literary streets. And in the basement of a house in Atlanta, Georgia, an unsuccessful pharmacist was brewing up something that started out as a soft drink, but ended up an icon of its own. His name was John Pemberton. Everybody in Atlanta knew him as Doc, and he'd spent most of his life looking for the product that was going to make him rich.
There's not a lot that is known about Pemberton and his life. He took some medical training early in his career. He had some training as a pharmacist. He served in the Civil War as an officer in the Confederate forces. And after the war, he settled in Columbus, Georgia, and began the practice of pharmacy, and also began the practice of trying to invent commercially successful products.
He introduced pills, hair dyes, medicines, and never managed to make a success of any of them. In 1870, he moved to Atlanta, a booming, brawling railroad town still rising from the ashes of Sherman's March. In those days, civic leaders were anxious to leave the wounds of the Civil War behind, make amends with the North, and join the 19th century's Industrial Revolution. They called it the New South, and Atlanta would lead the way. The city's cash crop was cash, and Doc Pemberton was hoping to harvest his share.
These are not traditional values of the kinds of characters we see, for example, in Gone with the Wind, who are interested in preserving the old traditions and staying on the old plantation. This is not Mr. Pemberton.
Unfortunately, Atlanta wasn't any kinder to the pharmacist than Columbus had been. He still couldn't come up with a real moneymaker. But by the spring of 1886, Pemberton had yet another bright idea, and more importantly, a new business partner, a Yankee.
I love the idea that Coke is founded by this odd couple, because you have this handsome chemist, a Civil War hero, Doc Pemberton from Columbus, Georgia. But we wouldn't know what we were talking about today if it hadn't been for this diminutive Yankee veteran of the Union Army who just wandered into town with a small printing press and tried to gain a career in advertising, and that's Frank Robinson.
Robinson's advertising know-how made him a natural partner for Pemberton, who was always better at creating products than he was at selling them. Together they decided to focus on that new idea Pemberton had been tinkering with, a beverage. They'd be staking their claim not at the medicine counter, but at a new American institution, the soda fountain.
From here, from there, from everywhere they came, attracted to the current counterpart of the inns and watering places of colonial days. The new gathering place of a new age, the soda fountain, helping to make the 90s gay.
Soda fountain wasn't just a place to go and refresh yourself because you were thirsty. It was a place to sit down with your friends, to have conversations, to talk about the politics, the culture. And so it was a place where people naturally gathered.
They're important as new kinds of meeting places in a changing downtown atmosphere that includes both men and women, for one thing. This is a place where ladies can go without fear of censorship. They can go to drugstores and sit at a soda fountain and partake in some ice cream confection.
And they were especially important to this Victorian age. At a time when the temperance movement was at its height, no decent woman, or man for that matter, could be seen in a saloon. Atlanta voted to close all its bars in 1885. But a soda fountain was a place where everyone could gather. Even then, soda fountains offered a dizzying array of flavors, variations on well-known tastes like strawberry, lemon, or chocolate. All were prepared by mixing a thick syrup with carbonated water and adding ice. Pemberton hoped to come up with something that would stand apart from the crowd. For months, he worked in the basement of the Atlanta house that served as his home and laboratory. He added flavorings to boiling water to make a syrup, and every so often, he'd dispatch a sample to the soda fountain at Jacob's Pharmacy to see what people thought.
It's very hard to go back to May of 1886 and try and figure out what was in the mind of a man like John Pemberton. My guess is that in his mind, he was just trying to find a magical formula that was going to sell. And so you took it one drink at a time. You took it one container of syrup at a time. People said they liked it. Let's try another one.
On May 8, 1886, he decided that he finally had it right. It was a brand new flavor, and more than a century later, it's hard to understand the impact it must have had on the first people who drank it. It's not as if Pemberton had created a new kind of cola. There were no colas, period.
The cola flavor is a very distinct kind of flavor. And it's something that flavor chemists tell us is something that you forget very quickly, so that you can have a cola flavored drink and maybe half an hour later you're ready to have another cola flavored drink.
Of course, no one knew this in 1886. It was up to Frank Robinson to sell this new concoction. His first step, name the product.
Coca-Cola. It's catchy. It's like Route 66. You can't imagine it being any other way. Something catchy about the repetitions, the O's, the U's, all of that stuff. If they had called it elixir of wild mountain grape or something, I doubt they'd still be around today.
And because he was a bookkeeper, he had this fine 19th century Spencerian hand, and so he wrote it out in script. And it's Frank Robinson's signature, if you will, that created the famous logo for Coca-Cola, a logo that has remained almost the same for 115 years.
Robinson also took out the very first advertisement for Coca-Cola in the May 29th Atlanta Constitution. Unfortunately, this first ad was almost buried on the page by solicitations for Pope the Hatter. It might have seemed that making this new drink a success would be relatively simple.
Syrup, finely chipped ice, bubbling carbonated water. Yes, people talked about it, tried it, and even then learned the happy enjoyment to be found in the pause that refreshes.
In reality, it wasn't quite as simple as all that. In 1886, Pemberton only sold about 25 gallons of Coca-Cola syrup.
In his first year of operation, he made about $50, but he incurred expenses of about $76. So that's not a very good ledger sheet.
Even worse, Doc Pemberton was not a well man. Before he and Robinson had a chance to turn Coca-Cola around, stomach ailments that had plagued him since the Civil War flared up again. Pemberton took to his bed, and his company nearly went under. The true success of Coca-Cola would come too late for the man who created it. John Pemberton died in August 1888 at the age of 57, never having tasted the success he had sought all his life.
Pemberton was just one of these guys who was always trying to, get the golden ring, and he just didn't make it. I mean, he had no history of success. And I think there's a good argument that might suggest that had John Pemberton remained the person behind the product, that the product would never have achieved the success that it has achieved.
You wonder why he didn't do more to take advantage of his invention, but of course at the time it was worthless and it hadn't become what it would become. And if you'd bet on Coca-Cola back in its first year or two, you'd be a rich man today, but you'd have been considered a reckless man back then.
In fact, the man who would rescue Doc Pemberton's invention probably couldn't have been any less reckless. Asa Griggs Candler once asked Doc Pemberton for a job and was turned down. Like Pemberton, he'd come to Atlanta to seek his fortune. He had arrived in the city at age 21 with $1.75 in his pocket, looking for work in a drugstore. He couldn't get a job at Pemberton's, but he eventually recovered from that blow. Unlike Pemberton, he did make his fortune in Atlanta. By the late 1880s, his company was taking in as much as $100,000 a year. He was also a pillar of rectitude. No one could accuse Asa Candler of being a frivolous man, whether in his business dealings or his personal beliefs. For him, the two were intertwined, a common way of looking at the world for businessmen of the time.
Corporate America in general around Asa Candler's time was fascinated by the notion of, I guess what you'd call the social gospel, that one would go into business with the same fervor that one would go into religion and craft a better world on earth.
I think Candler was just a great, robust capitalist. I think he wanted to make money, and I don't think he found it at all inconsistent with being a devout Christian as well. One of the things I like about this man is that he starts annual meetings of his company by leading the singing of Onward Christian Soldiers.
Sometime in 1888, Robinson came to Candler and asked the pharmacist if he wanted to invest in Coca-Cola. The answer was no. He wasn't interested in a new product, and besides, his drugstore didn't have a soda fountain where he could sell Coca-Cola anyway. Then, a historic event. Asa Candler tried Coca-Cola for the first time. It is probably safe to call that one glass the most important Coke ever served. Later, Candler would claim that that one drink made him a true believer in the possibilities of Coca-Cola.
Candler's genius, I think, lie in the fact that he did see the opportunities that were there in broadening the base of the beverage out of its Atlanta beginnings into becoming increasingly more of a national beverage.
By 1891, Candler was the sole owner of Coca-Cola. His total investment, about $2,300. Sales had already begun to take off in Atlanta. Now Candler set about making Coca-Cola a household word.
What Candler possessed that Pemberton did not was a vision, and he also possessed a very strong marketing capability.
Of course, he didn't give up his other products right away.
And as a matter of fact, in early advertising for Coca-Cola, you sometimes will see this mouthwash, Delect Delave, on one side of a piece of advertising, Coca-Cola on the other. He was hedging his bets. He wasn't sure which was going to make it, so he had them both up there.
If Coca-Cola was going to expand beyond its regional roots, Candler would have to make people aware of this new beverage. He had to convince a skeptical public that it was special and make them care whether they got the real thing or not. But Candler had faith in Coca-Cola and believed that one glass would win over even the toughest customer. In the beginning, he turned to a trick Frank Robinson had been using, giving Coca-Cola away for free. He hired traveling salesmen to hand out tickets in cities and towns across the country, each one good for a free glass of Coca-Cola. In essence, Asa Candler wanted to buy the world of Coke.
And obviously the concept was, you'd try it once, you'd like it, the next time you came in, you'd pay for it. Very simple, elementary concept, but Coke was the first company to use that concept. And Candler was the one who recognized that in order to get business, you had to get folks to try the product first.
In 1895 alone, the company redeemed $7,700 worth of coupons, 154,000 glasses of Coke, and sales continued to climb. Of course, there was a limit to what coupons could do. At the end of the 19th century, there were no national media, no easy way to reach every citizen of a sprawling rural country. Putting the idea of Coca-Cola in people's minds meant finding creative ways to get this message out. So beginning in the 1890s, Asa Candler's company put the distinctive Coca-Cola logo on advertisements that would follow the consumer around.
Things like calendars, things like posters, things that people would carry with them like notebooks and bookmarks, things that would be used by the average person in the daily course of their business. And by the way, there was an ad for this new product, and maybe the next time they went into a soda fountain, they would try this new product.
Everything carried the name of the brand, and that's what we talk about today as great marketing, that you can have your brand in front of the consumer at every point of contact. And that's what Coca-Cola did even in 1890.
Today, these giveaway items command thousands of dollars from collectors. At the time, they helped separate Coca-Cola from a crowd of competitors and give it an air of class.
The ads feature women of prominence, attainment, and some artsiness. And that artistic quality, I think, has always been associated with Coca-Cola. The beautiful script, the Spencerian writing, which is something practiced by people who've had good schooling. Everything smacks of decorum and moving slightly above one's station in life.
Coca-Cola never, I think, thought about cost savings. They were doing all high-end production of all of their work. The advertisements, the illustrations, when they moved into photography, all of it was very high quality, and they were doing high quality printing at a time when there weren't very many choices of what they could do.
The 1-2 punch of coupons and advertising giveaways did the job. As early as 1897, the company's in-house magazine could claim, the great American eagle, that discriminating bird of freedom, is passionately fond of Coca-Cola because Coca-Cola has become a national drink. Still, bright as his company's future looked, Candler found that his success was being shadowed. Rumors had begun to spread that Coca-Cola was not just a simple soda fountain beverage. According to these rumors, it contained cocaine, even though cocaine had never been an added ingredient in Coca-Cola. The idea that his product was perceived as harmful enraged the straight-laced Sunday school teaching Candler. Indeed, Asa Candler's position was clear. He told the Atlanta Journal that he would shut the company down immediately if there were ever one single case of anyone being harmed by the drink. His final public word on the matter, and by extension the company's, was stated in an early pamphlet. There is not one indivisible atom of cocaine in an ocean of Coca-Cola. That is absolute and final. By the end of the 19th century, Coca-Cola was being sold in some quantity in all 46 states. Yet nearly all those sales came at soda fountains. Anyone who wanted to take a bottle of Coke with them was probably out of luck, and Asa Candler didn't see anything wrong with that.
One can make the argument that Candler lacked vision in the sense that he never grasped completely the potential of the bottled market. He did not go into bottling himself and had no interest in doing that.
Round and round, bottle after bottle, moving endlessly to satisfy the needs of thirsty people everywhere. Refreshment on the move.
Well, this bottle, for a lot of different reasons, is almost the perfect commercial package. First of all, it fits in the hand just perfectly. And I think the genius of the design is that it feels good. The embossed letters have a tactile quality to them. And it all enhances the anticipation of the drink itself. So I don't think they could have done any better.
Of course, before they created that bottle, they had to figure out if it was even feasible to sell Coca-Cola in bottles at all. Part of the problem was technological. If you wanted to put soda in bottles in the early 1890s, your best option was known as a Hutchinson bottle.
The unique thing about these bottles, and this is the way they bottled soft drinks at the time, was that the stopper was actually inside the bottle, and it was held in place by pressure from the soft drink, and there was a wire attached to the rubber or cork insert that was pulled tight inside the opening. And then when you're ready to drink it, you have to take your hand and pop it. And that's also where soda pop came from. They would take it and make the pop sound, but then that stopper would fall back into the product. So there might have been some quality issues.
But it wasn't until 1899 that Chattanooga, Tennessee businessman Benjamin Franklin Thomas and Joseph Whitehead approached Candler about bottling on a wide scale and really got the idea off the ground. Thomas and Whitehead's meeting with Asa Candler would become a legendary moment in Coca-Cola history.
Bottles. Bottles? Yes, sir. Bottles. Folks could take them home.
Candler's response was firm. He said, "Gentlemen, we have neither the money, nor brains, nor time to embark in the bottling business." But he was happy to sell these Chattanooga businessmen Coca-Cola syrup if they were willing to go to the trouble of getting it into bottles and ensuring its quality once it got there. A contract was drawn up, and Candler gave them the right to bottle Coca-Cola, with no mention of royalties. In essence, he signed away the rights for nothing.
You know, we look at that today and you say, what a crazy decision. Why did he give that away? In fact, it was a very wise business decision, because you were going to have to go out and you were going to have to build bottling plants, you were going to have to buy glass, you were going to have to buy equipment, you were going to have to figure out a sales and distribution system, all of which was going to require enormous capitalization. Capitalization that Candler didn't have at the time.
Thomas and Whitehead didn't have it either, so they turned around and sold smaller territories to independent businessmen across the country. By 1909, there were bottling plants in 379 American cities and towns. These early bottlers were usually ambitious small-town businessmen eager to get a piece of a national corporation, within limits, of course.
Well, frequently the franchisee, the bottler, would say, no, I don't think I want that 300-mile territory. I'll just have a radius of 25 miles of the courthouse square, because that was the length that you could come in and out in a day with a mule drawing a wagon.
Those delivery wagons were soon carrying Coke to customers from Kentucky to Alaska and all points in between. Ads trumpeted the portability of Coca-Cola, a beverage as modern as the horseless carriage, or as the new bottle caps that kept the drink fresh. Somehow, a bottle of Coca-Cola fit naturally into the culture of America at the time. It was an era of great public events and entertainments, amusement parks, county fairs, and, of course, baseball games. But the more Coca-Cola got out into the world, the more the company was plagued by a scourge that had been around almost since the very beginning: imitators.
Candler and his associates would describe the imitators as serpents in the grass. There'd be lime colas and there'd be cherry colas. There was a company called Coke. People who would spring up and try to capitalize on the success of this new product.
Bottles made the problem worse. At the time, Coca-Cola was being sold in generic, straight-sided bottles. The labels bore Candler's signature as proof of their authenticity, but that didn't always help.
These bottles, when they were sold in a retail store, were kept in a barrel full of ice. There really wasn't a dedicated place to sell soft drinks, so the bottle is sitting probably shoulder high in ice, and these paper labels would come off. So when you might be taking the bottle out of the ice, it may or may not have a label on it.
The only way to deal with this issue was to standardize the package, to come up with a bottle and a shape that was so unique that you could tell it was a Coca-Cola bottle by feeling it, even in the dark. A bottle that was so unique that even if you saw one shattered on the street, you would be able to tell just by looking at the pieces and the shape that that was a Coca-Cola bottle.
The Coca-Cola Company put out a call for submissions, and the winning design was announced in 1916. The winning design had been created at a glass factory in Terre Haute, Indiana, after an employee looked up cocoa in an encyclopedia, mistakenly believing cocoa had something to do with Coca-Cola. The bottle mimicked the shape of the cocoa tree's seed pod.
When they ran tests through the bottling line didn't hold this bottle up because of the shape. To take it to the bottlers, we had to streamline it a bit.
A bottle that was shaped somewhat like the female form, a bottle that we refer to today as the contour bottle, which has been referred to in the past as the hobble skirt bottle by many people, because again it did sort of mimic the female shape. And when the Root Glass Company produced this bottle, showed it to the bottlers, and patented it so that it was protected. They took out an ad that said, "We've bottled up the pirates of business."
2 bottles of Coca-Cola. Yeah? Make sure it's Coca-Cola. All them bottles look pretty much alike.
Not now, they don't.
Is that Coca-Cola?
Yes, sir. And that's the brand new bottle for Coca-Cola. The hobble skirt bottle. They patterned it after the hobble skirt Betty wears.
The hobble skirt bottle. Pretty nifty, huh? I'll take the hobble skirt. I'll take Betty.
Thank you, boys.
By 1919, the new design was rolling through bottling plants around the country. Over the years, that green glass bottle designed in Terre Haute, Indiana, would become the world's single most celebrated package. Designer Raymond Loewy said it had 20 cleverly concealed devices to lure and satisfy the hand. Andy Warhol depicted it in some of his first pop art paintings. And the bottle has even been celebrated in poetry.
Heaviness and strength are its attributes, and a smoothness of throat. Even here, in its nugatory and neglected stance, it sends out a gelid touch into the cellar light, a cold, stony impetus towards coolness. And it outlives forever the ephemeral and amber flurry of its winking foam, the million-eyed beady run of its tingling passage.
The First World War was the greatest conflict the world had ever seen, and it marked the start of a tough time for Coke. By 1917, when America entered the war, the Coca-Cola Company was the world's largest consumer of sugar. War brought rationing that endangered the business. Because some of their colorings were sugar-based, the company even considered a clear Coke, but consumers claimed they could taste the difference. And the end of the war didn't bring an end to the problem. Instead, it brought recession and fluctuating sugar prices that almost killed the company. These crises took their toll on Asa Candler, the man who once had such faith in Coca-Cola.
The Candlers, quite frankly, thought that soft drinks perhaps had gone about as far as they were going to go.
In 1919, the Candler family sold the Coca-Cola Company. The sale price, $25 million, the largest financial transaction in the history of the South. Not a bad return on Candler's $2,300 investment. In retrospect, it was probably a good time for a changing of the guard. American culture was about to be turned upside down.
If you think historically, the Roaring Twenties, the whole concept of the decade is characterized by credible movement. People were on the go, constantly. And when you're on the go, you get thirsty.
But what was the right drink for this fast new way of life? Prohibition certainly didn't help matters.
The alternatives to drinking in the 1920s are not huge if you want to partake of this daring modern life. The invention of mixed drinks, the martini glass, all of that wonderful apparatus that went with drinking. Then what's the alternative in a modern world? Drinking lemonade is your grandma's era. So what do you do in public to show that you're with it and modern and sophisticated? Well, I think your best alternative is probably Coca-Cola.
It was during the 1920s that Coca-Cola went from being popular to ubiquitous.
Coke really then took it into the next level of saying, we want to be in front of you at every possible chance you have to purchase a Coca-Cola. If that's in the soda fountain, if that's in the gas station, if that's in the grocery store, wherever it is, we want to be there with you because we are America, we are part of your lives, and we want you to be with us.
Within an arm's reach of desire was a phrase the company used frequently then. Technological innovations helped make that phrase reality. Specially built coolers, and industry first, brought ice-cold Cokes to gas stations serving all those new Model Ts. Cardboard carriers filled with 6 bottles, the world's first six-packs, were another Coca-Cola invention.
Now, today, that just seems so elementary. But back in the 1920s, soft drinks were sold one at a time, and people tended to go into grocery stores, buy them one at a time, because that's what you could easily hold. If you produce something that allows you to take 6 at a time home, what an incredible volume jump that creates for you in the marketplace.
Boy, oh boy.
What a wonderful idea, Helen, to serve Coca-Cola at home.
They're selling it in cartons now.
Cartons? Yes, 6 bottles in a little pasteboard container.
We buy 2 or 3 of them every week.
Business was good in the 20s. Business was good, and we aim to keep it good.
Keeping business good in the 20s was the responsibility of the Coca-Cola Company's new president, Robert Woodruff. He'd faced the chaos of the Jazz Age, and then some. He took charge in 1923 and would control the fortunes of Coca-Cola for more than 5 decades. Born in 1889, Woodruff had been a college dropout, a day laborer, a fire extinguisher salesman, and eventually the respected and ambitious vice president of a Cleveland truck manufacturer. He was also the boss's son. His father was the chairman of the board of Coca-Cola. Yet any cries of nepotism were quickly silenced by the fact that Robert Woodruff knew how to sell soda pop.
Stories go on about him traveling throughout the South, and at every opportunity where soft drinks were sold, he would stop and he would look at the bottle caps in the coolers and see how many Coca-Colas were sold as opposed to oranges and grapes and other soft drink products. And he would take that as a measure of how well he was doing. And he was never doing well enough.
He's traveling through Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan one winter on the train, and goes in a train station, and there are people bundled up in woolens by a stove, and they're sweating and they're hot. In the dead of winter, it's 35 degrees below zero, but they're hot and they're drinking a Coca-Cola. And he looks at per capita figures and he sees that as much Coke is consumed in Montreal as Miami, and he begins to think we can't just be a summertime drink anymore. We want to sell Coke around the calendar.
Perhaps most importantly, Robert Woodruff understood the power of his company's most priceless asset, its legendary secret formula.
Well, people always ask, is there a secret formula? And of course, Woodruff did a lot to make sure that that was part of the American mystique. I mean, he said it was a secret and then went about publicizing its existence in every way that he could.
When he first came to the company, the formula itself was being held as collateral for a loan from a New York bank. Once the loan was paid, Woodruff personally escorted the formula on the train back to Atlanta, accompanied by guards and great public fanfare.
And put it in the vault in the basement of his family-controlled bank, which is today SunTrust, and it's still there.
The idea of the secret formula would become a source of endless speculation and interest to people around the world. Who was allowed to know the formula? Where was it actually kept? Was it actually even written down? On these questions, the company would always remain tight-lipped.
It is one of those things that we won't talk about. We don't want to make public commentary about the number of people who know the formula, exactly where it is, exactly what form it's in, all those kinds of questions. It really just helps keep folks interested in the product. That's a good thing.
I mean, on the face of it, it's rather an absurdity. One would think that any kind of good qualitative analysis and good chemistry could come up very clearly with what the formula was. But it has added to the mystique, the identification of the brand name, and is one of the great success stories in the history of marketing.
But beyond the six-packs, coolers, wintertime, and even the secret formula, Robert Woodruff had one clear vision: that this all-American national beverage really should be sold around the world. Cuba and Mexico, among other countries, saw the arrival of Coca-Cola in the early years of the century, always in small quantities. But Woodruff was determined to take Coke worldwide on the largest possible scale.
I think Woodruff's unusual in this respect, that there may have been other American businessmen who appreciated the potential of a global market, but you didn't find many of them in the American South. But Woodruff had had the advantage of working for a truck maker up in Cleveland. He'd made friends with a lot of top-notch businessmen in New York. He had much more of a worldview than you would commonly have expected to find in Atlanta or anywhere else in the South in his period.
And he sets in motion an organization that is designed to sell Coca-Cola outside the United States. Huge visionary. A thought that conflicted with a lot of his own board of directors. People just thought this was kind of a nutty idea.
The real point I think to make is that if there were those who were opposed to what he was doing, that didn't really mean very much. This was really a company which was driven by this individual who was able to use the force of his will and the financial power that he had in terms of controlling the firm to take the firm in what directions he wished to do.
This was a task that would indeed require a great deal of faith.
The problem was getting it beyond the expatriate community. For years and years, you could get Cokes in luxury hotels, on steamships, post exchanges, on military bases, but the native populations of the world didn't know it at all.
England, for example, seemed like a natural market. The English had an affinity for soda waters, and there was no language barrier to overcome. But England also had no history of iced beverages. In a country without coolers and soda fountains, Coke was a no-go. It would take 2 more decades and changes to the global culture to make Woodruff's dream reality. By the late 1920s, though, Coke was universally available in America. According to Fortune magazine, out of 110,000 soda fountains in the U.S., only 6 didn't sell Coke. And Americans were keeping these fountains busy. In the prosperous yet harried society of the 1920s, the idea of simply taking a break for refreshment and pleasure became more and more important.
With the increased pace of modernity, you have to be a given place at a given time. So the notion of taking a break means that you take a break from what the established order is from 9 to 5. This was an area for personal expression, a break. And what better modern personal expression, indeed, than this most urban of beverages, Coca-Cola.
The pause that refreshes, they called it, starting in 1929. It was one of the most successful and long-lasting slogans in the history of the brand. Just as important as the slogan were the visuals that went with it. The decades between the wars would become known as the golden age of American advertising art. And the best artists of the time were working for Coke, showcasing not only the modern scene, but an idealized America that was fast fading. Artists like Norman Rockwell and N.C. Wyeth portrayed Coke as an intrinsic part of life in the United States, past or present, a constant in a changing time. But the most lasting contribution of these ads to pop culture was also the most surprising, and it came at Christmas.
The development and use of Santa Claus in advertising for Coca-Cola comes out of the fact that the winter months were not strong months for the sale of soft drinks, and for Coca-Cola specifically. They were trying to come up with an advertising concept that would link Coca-Cola to the winter months and very specifically to the holidays.
The first ad showed a department store Santa refreshing himself with a Coke after his shift. Well, that's not what the head of advertising had in mind. And so the next year, in 1931, had Sunbloom, who created our modern Dutch Uncle, luminous, ruddy-cheeked Santa, made it the real Santa.
Until then, Santas had come in all shapes, sizes, demeanors, and clothes. After Sunblom, Santa was always white-bearded, red-suited, jolly, and fat.
And when he was interviewed on this subject, Sunblom said that he made him the opposite of those depressing Depression-era street corner Santas that he saw around Chicago, who were always skinny old alcoholics standing on the street corner ringing bells, and that what he wanted to do was to create an image of happiness and abundance, and so his Santa was fat. That, too, is a way of reassuring people that the American holiday is going to continue to be one of benevolence and goodwill and abundance, even in hard times.
The Christmas of 1931, that first brought the Coca-Cola Santa to the world, was a tough one for many Americans. The Great Depression had rolled across the land. There was little need for a pause in a country that seemed to have stopped dead in its tracks. Yet Coke sales stayed high. In tough times, people cling to the familiar, and Coca-Cola was certainly that.
Hi there, fellas.
Hiya, Sam.
Found a job yet?
Not yet.
Well, times is tough, all right.
Yeah, I'll say. 2 bottles of Coca-Cola.
During the Depression, you could always call a fella and say, Larry, meet me down for Coca-Cola. I want to buy you a Coca-Cola. And you'd ask, you could always afford a 5-cent drink. And that was the sign of good taste and friendship.
Our lady luck was Coca-Cola.
Stopping to have a Coke helped people remember a time when they had a job to take a break from. And Coca-Cola advertising continued to reflect the hopes and dreams of Americans. Hollywood stars, who were letting Americans escape at their local movie theater, also became reminders of how Coke could help people escape too. There would be other trials in the decade to come, but the 1940s would see a defining moment for Coca-Cola. By 1941, the world had divided itself into 2 camps, one armed, the other unarmed. On the surface, life in the United States was going on as usual. But in 1941, there was an undercurrent of tension in the air across America, anxiety that manifested itself even in this promotional film that the Coca-Cola Company released that year.
Extra, extra, get your latest war extra, read all about it. Extra paper,
Have you seen the latest edition? I suppose you have. I suppose you feel pretty much as I do about it. Awful, isn't it? The headlines, I mean. Death, destruction, upheaval, unrest. It makes you wonder what the world's coming to. Yes, sir. What's the world coming to?
America's entry into the war put Coca-Cola in a curious bind. Gearing up for war production meant that more money was flowing and demand was rising. War also brought restrictions on vital materials that hit many businesses hard, including Coca-Cola.
They had experience from the First World War, where sugar had become a problem in terms of syrup manufacture. So that was something that they were very much concerned about.
There were even restrictions upon kind of materials we could use for advertising and kind of materials we could use for packaging. So instead of using metal for six-pack carriers, we were using wood.
Many companies switched over to producing military goods. Car companies made Jeeps, clothing manufacturers made uniforms, lipstick makers churned out shell casings. This sort of switchover wasn't an option for Coca-Cola, but Coke did have a major ally as the war effort went into full swing: its emotional ties to the American people, especially to the men who would be fighting the war. Suddenly, cabbies, soda jerks, mechanics, and farmers found themselves on the battlefield. Thousands of miles from home, living on K rations and cigarettes, confronted every day with the horrors of modern war. GIs were desperate for any link to the land they were fighting for.
For many GIs, Coca-Cola was much more than a soft drink. It was a symbol of American life. It was a symbol of what they were fighting for.
From the earliest days of the war, letters came into the Coca-Cola Company and its bottlers from American troops around the world.
If anyone asked us what we're fighting for, we think half of us would answer the right to buy Coca-Cola again. As much as we want. Even a mirage cannot slack our thirst, and we must fall back on those dreams of yesteryear, when we moved up to the soda fountain and sighed contentedly, "Cherry Coke, large glass, plenty of ice."
Letters like these inspired a legendary decree, credited to Woodruff, that every GI should be able to buy a bottle of Coke for 5 cents, no matter what it cost the company.
It was patriotic, it was a wonderful statement, and the firm did a lot to make that come true, but it also was a brilliant business decision as well.
But there was a problem with that pledge. Bottled Coca-Cola was heavy, bulky, and difficult to transport. Arms and vital materiel had priority on supply ships. There was no practical way to get cases of Coke to Anzio, Guadalcanal, or North Africa. The solution was daring but simple. Instead of shipping bottles back and forth, take bottling plants to the front lines. The company would deliver entire portable factories to both theaters of the war, set them up near the troops, and bottle Coke right there.
Now we've got a very risky and costly proposition here because it's expensive to go out into the field, but Coke does.
It's easy for us in hindsight to say, oh, what a brilliant move that was, but in fact it was a dangerous economic move in some respects, because we didn't know that the Americans were going to win the war. For all we knew, we might not win the war at all.
Experimental plants were opened in 1942 and worked. Allied brass, who understood the importance of morale, were happy to get behind the project. none more so than a Coke drinker named Eisenhower. In June 1943, this telegram came from Ike's headquarters in North Africa to Coke headquarters in Atlanta. In it, a tall order: 6 million bottles of Coke a month, and fast. Filling this order was the responsibility of longtime company engineers, who served as technical observers in Army uniform but without official Army rank.
The technical observers, or TOs, who went out into the field, they faced danger. Some were killed. After the Normandy invasion, they went riding across the plains in France with these smaller field bottling units in the back of jeeps. They helped the GI liberate Europe. They were there as part of the scene.
And these guys were working under conditions where, you didn't have electricity easily, you didn't have a lot of raw materials to work with, and you had to basically make it up as you went along.
And suddenly, you have the old familiar Coke bottle showing up in foxholes with American GIs, and their emotional response to this familiar icon from home is genuine, it's heartfelt, it's lasting.
And because of that, we have literally hundreds of letters from GIs recounting their emotional experience at being able to have just a little bit of American life near the battlefield.
I can truthfully say that I haven't seen smiles spread over a bunch of boys' faces as they did when they saw Coca-Cola in this godforsaken place. It is surprising what a little thing like a Coca-Cola means to a man in the fighting over here.
Coke became a fixture at stage door canteens around the world. And here, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt enjoys the pause that refreshes. The soda's new worldwide presence inspired a new slogan, the Global High Sign, a tagline that accompanied ads featuring soldiers and sailors relaxing with Coca-Cola.
And I think that they really helped sell the war effort. If you look at some of those ads, it's men in uniform talking about the war. They didn't hide it. They didn't try to avoid it at all. And oh, by the way, you should have a Coca-Cola, just like the soldiers that are away from home.
By war's end, there were 64 bottling plants in operation, from Egypt to Iceland, from Iran to New Guinea. 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola were sold to GIs around the world. The cost of bottling near the front lines had been high. Keeping the price for soldiers at 5 cents a bottle was often a losing proposition. But the investment would prove to be worth it.
95% of all soft drinks sold to U.S. troops abroad were Coca-Cola during the war.
A survey by the American Legion just after the war showed that more than 60% of veterans said Coke was their favorite soft drink. The closest runner-up got about 7%.
Since this had created such a powerful link between the values they were fighting for and this product, it seems inevitable that after World War II, they would choose that product above all others for most occasions and begin to introduce it into the new family life that's coming into focus as a part of the suburbanizing of America.
These are your neighbors, people like you, with time for leisure, time for modern living. These people are in tune with the times.
In the 1950s, after 2 decades of depression and World War, America was ready to sit back, relax, and have a Coke. It was something of a golden age for Coca-Cola, the perfect accompaniment to an era of good, clean fun.
These fellows are pretty satisfied. Yard chores done, they're taking time out for refreshment.
The years of shortages, penny pinching, and rationing were over, forgotten in a burst of confidence and prosperity. By then, Coke was secure in its place as America's favorite soft drink, something people could agree on in all walks of life. As for the competition, well, nobody at the Atlanta headquarters of the Coca-Cola Company was too concerned about that.
In my days with the company, the opposition was called, quote, the imitator, end quote. Now, I did hear someone occasionally refer to a product called P-Cola, but I never worried much about the opposition, and I felt like we could always overcome it.
But even a cultural icon can have growing pains. For more than 3 decades, you either bought a Coke at a soda fountain or in the classic green bottle. 6.5 ounces, no more, no less. Robert Woodruff, still the driving force behind Coke, thought things were perfect just as they were. It was consumers who changed the way Coke was delivered in typical 50s fashion. Before the war, the grocery store delivery boy would lug home a case of bottles and put it in the icebox for you. Now housewives were doing their own shopping, and few relished the chore of handling cases of Cokes.
Well, as one of Woodruff's critics within the company said, you're demanding that a housewife carry home a wooden crate with 24 thick glass bottles with 6.5 ounces of Coke each in it. It's hard for a truck driver to lift that, let alone a housewife. We're not giving the American consumer what she wants.
Oh yeah, I've worked routes, and I've ridden routes, and you would have to be a pretty sturdy man. I know I was up in Baltimore, and we had the Baltimore Colts tackle, Art Donovan, who worked out delivering Coca-Cola in the summers to stay in shape.
The answer came in 1955.
There's a giant living in our house. It's Coca-Cola in the new family-size bottle. Biggest bottle of Coke you ever saw.
Bigger bottles, all carefully designed to resemble the old familiar classic bottle.
In 3 bottle sizes.
As one executive put it, bringing out another bottle was like being unfaithful to your wife.
Coca-Cola in the standard size and
But consumers had spoken.
And just look at how that big family-size bottle makes Coke so easy to serve. Use that big...
The thing you want most in the 50s is easy. So you want the supplies of Coke right in your house. That's a real change for Coca-Cola, too, which has been so much associated with the workplace and then even with the armed forces. Suddenly now, it becomes something that is indispensable for the home.
And the message of these changes was coming to Americans through a wooden box that stood in the corner of more and more living rooms every day.
Come on in. Fish is the name. You know, I enjoy watching TV just like you do. And I know this. TV's even more fun with a bottle of Coke at hand. There's nothing like the flavor of ice-cold Coca-Cola.
In the 50s, Americans watching television were largely watching themselves, and the parade of goods brought to them courtesy of post-war prosperity.
Electric Kalamazoo. To end, you'll see how like it lots of gasoline that...
Coca-Cola had been on the air, the radio, since 1927.
Yes, friends, it's time for another transcribed session of the Coke Club. And here's Morton Downey.
But television was really the medium, I think, that brought it to the forefront because it was in everybody's homes. But more importantly, You could see the product, you could hear the product, because remember they always were showing the carbonation and how everything was fizzing out of the glass, and also see people being refreshed by the product.
Television commercials were rare in those days. Instead, companies would sponsor entire shows and weave their advertising into the flow of the program. The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet was sponsored by Coca-Cola for several years.
Look, from now on, I'll serve Coca-Cola and you serve the steak.
Not on your life. Parties are more fun when you do the cooking. Here, have a Coke and cheer up.
That's the best idea yet.
Or you would have Kit Carson or one of his sidekicks showing kids how to rope a steer or mount a horse. And after you'd gone through this bit of activity, naturally you'd be thirsty, and Kit Carson and his sidekick would have Cokes and share them with their fans.
Boy, when it comes to real refreshment, there's nothing like a nice cold Coke.
Bring home the Coke, bring home the Coke. Everybody's happy when you bring home the Coke.
Commercials, 30 or 60-second spots, also came along in the 1950s, and their themes were as varied as could be imagined. Animation.
50 million times a day, at home, at work, or on the way. There's nothing like a Coca-Cola, nothing like a Coke.
Carton of Coke.
Celebrities.
Hi there. I'm Anita Bryan. We're having a few friends over this evening, and I'm just making sure we'll have enough Coca-Cola on hand.
No substitute for the
Special
good taste
effects.
of Coca-Cola. Even the bubbles taste better. There's no substitute
And
for
just
Coca-Cola
plain
that
old-fashioned
helps you love it
Americana.
I work in a factory, and when I take a break, I cool off with a Coke.
I don't work at all. I just stay home and enjoy Coke all the time.
Coca-Cola puts you at your sparkling best. Bring home the Coke.
The best loved sparkling drink is Coca-Cola.
These commercials showcased Coke for what it had always been, a pleasant accompaniment to daily life. And the life shown in these ads was one of leisure, relaxation, and comfort.
And you say, oh yeah, that's me. That's the way I serve Coca-Cola, or that's the way I want to serve Coca-Cola, or that's what I like to be doing. I like to have Coca-Cola when I'm on the boat or at the pool or whatever.
Many Americans watching these ads were able to identify with this standard of living for the very first time in their lives. And around the world, people were turning to that way of life and hoping to emulate it in their own way. It was a unique historical moment, one that would help Coca-Cola move once and for all from an American drink to a global one.
If you ever go down Trinidad, they make you feel so very glad. Calypso sing and make up rhyme, guarantee you one real good fine time. Drinking rum and Coca-Cola, go down Point Cumana, both mother and daughter, working for the Yankee dollar. Oh, beat it, man, beat it.
Starting in the late 1940s, a sight that was commonplace on the streets of America was becoming just as common around the world. The familiar red Coca-Cola logo. History was on the company's side.
The period from the end of World War II up through the 1960s and maybe even into the 70s is sometimes referred to as the Pax Americana, the American peace. It was a period that included the early formation and development of the Cold War, but also was a period when American commercial and economic dominance was at its highest apogee.
In the years after the war, cities across Europe and Asia lay in ruins. Developed economies had been shattered. Shortages, rationing, and belt-tightening persisted well into the 1950s in countries from England to Japan. But America had survived the war unscathed. The standard of living in the United States exerted a unique magic to those still struggling to rebuild their own worlds.
I think in a situation of extreme deprivation, Coca-Cola would mean the same thing perhaps that packages of gum meant to little children who were given them by GIs. And that is some exotic, wonderful, unimaginable treat that has practically fallen from the sky.
It was within this environment that the Coca-Cola company really was stretching its international legs. And indeed, because of the unique identification of its trademark, became known as a leading American firm, and a firm which also was uniquely American.
And the massive effort to get Coca-Cola to frontline troops in World War II finally helped the company gain a foothold around the world.
First of all, it introduced Coca-Cola to the civilian populations in a lot of those areas. The troops were the major beneficiaries, but some of the civilians got it too, and they enjoyed it. Secondly, as they moved through these various areas, contacts were made with various government officials. And so, in the post-war period of time, there were entree points that hadn't existed previously, so you could begin discussions with people about establishing more permanent bottling facilities in the post-war period of time. So it just wasn't, okay, we were there, now we're going to build a bottling plant. You were there as a guest and a citizen, if you will, of those countries. And a lot of relationships were formed during that wartime period that resulted in business relationships in the post-war period.
The progress achieved by the Coca-Cola industry since the founding of its first Italian plant has been tremendous. Today, Coca-Cola is to be found everywhere, in the largest and smallest towns, at every time and in any season.
Bottling plant openings like this one in India became full-scale celebrations. And not only was Coke available, it was selling, and fast.
It may have been aspirational for some of these folks. The American lifestyle was widely regarded as being something that people, like to emulate. And to have the #1 soft drink product in their markets, that was a good thing.
It gives you a sort of American vacation, like going to the movies gives you.
It brought with it the effervescence of American society in the effervescence of its drink.
One reflection of that American society came in the advertising used in those days, which often came directly from the United States.
And early on, they did use advertising that was pretty generic, what we called pattern advertising. So the same image of a pretty girl drinking a Coke might be used almost universally. And the only thing that might change would be the language.
Just as Coca-Cola had crept into popular culture in America, it began to do the same around the world. In Brazil, people started calling buses Coca-Colas because the fare was about the same as the cost of a Coke. A young Tokyo waitress described her feeling about the drink by saying, "It has the sweet and bitter taste of first love."
Truly an American custom that has become a world custom. Everywhere in the world, there is the need to pause and go refreshed.
There's nothing that prevents people from having Coca-Cola. There's nothing about it that's in conflict with religious beliefs, with dietary requirements, any of those sorts of things. The only place in which Coke is not enjoyed is where politics has entered into the fray.
Der
In the same way that Americans had made Coca-Cola their drink, people in countries worldwide now made Coke their own as well.
Ob du singst im Männerchore, ob mit Damenchor gemischt, ob am Brunnen vor dem Tore, Coca-Cola, das erfrischt.
Coca-Cola grande le da mucho más por su dinero más, refresco y calidad.
Coca-Cola refreshes you best. Coke is all the way, the refreshingness. Only Coke will do when you're thirsty, yes. Coca-Cola refreshes you best.
It's an American brand, and the westernization is a very big part of that. But it's the relationship that they're building. They somehow see themselves in the Coca-Cola advertisements. They want to be like the people in the Coca-Cola advertisements. They want to be refreshed by the drink. There is this kind of mystique, if you will, about the brand that transcends everything.
Time magazine described the beverage's global reach this way. It is simpler, sharper evidence than the Marshall Plan, or a Voice of America broadcast, that the U.S. has gone out into the world to stay.
I'm Paul Austin. We have just concluded a brief review of the past. It was a stimulating and rewarding experience to see the growth of Coca-Cola over the years. But today we're concerned about present and future. We will have plans to show you later on, which will indicate to you that our future is going to be more rewarding and stimulating by far than has been our past.
Rewarding and stimulating indeed. In the tumult of the 1960s and 1970s, it seemed like anything was possible, good or bad. But Coca-Cola was as much a part of these times as it had been in the placid 50s, and this changing culture was still reflected in ads for Coke. Taken together, the way Coca-Cola was advertised during the 60s and 70s is a snapshot of how America viewed these bewildering years.
Once upon a time, it was 1960.
At first, the 60s looked an awful lot like the 50s. As the decade began, Coke was reaching out to American youth by sponsoring films about sports or other youthful activities, always making sure to show that Coke was the perfect accompaniment to teenage fun.
Another example of consideration. Someone remembers that chaperones like refreshments too. For Judy and Lee,
But youth and times were changing.
for Linda and Jack,
Coke's great success in becoming the beloved drink of the American GI meant that it was the drink of my parents' generation, the generation that fought World War II. And you look at some of Coke's advertising in the 50s and 60s, and it was woefully out of step with this new, allegedly hip generation that was coming along.
The first step Coca-Cola took toward this new generation was a jingle, first recorded by a folk group called the Limelighters in 1963.
Coca-Cola, things go better with Coca-Cola, things go better with Coke. Life is much more fun when you're refreshed, and Coke refreshes you best.
It was just going to be a demo for the Coca-Cola Company, and had some flat notes in it, some place we had to splice together, 2 or 3 takes, but it was enough to take down there. They loved it. I said, fine, now give me some real money and we'll do you a real slick jingle. The minute the Limelighters knew they were going to be working for Coca-Cola and make all this money, they never sung it right again. We went on the air for years. With the demo. With that demo.
It's the refreshingness. Mood goes better with
fun goes better with you, go better with Coke. The real life one puts extra fun in you and everything you do. So,
but it had something about it that
it had a present. It jumped out at you.
Yeah, it had a present.
It had a certain present that it just jumped out at you.
Fun and food and you go better with, things go better with Coke.
And we took it around the world. It translated to almost every language.
Lorsque vous êtes réunis avec tous vos amis.
Let's stop and romp with the swingin' Supreme.
I dig your style, the way you smile. Let's have a Coke and talk a while. You'll go back.
People like the Supremes and Roy Orbison and Petula Clark, Aretha Franklin, all sang the jingle for Coca-Cola. What you see is advertising for Coca-Cola being very reflective of a new music. And is Coke just a natural part of this new phenomenon?
When you're with a girl and you're out walking, something's gone wrong and she ain't talking. Now's the time for Coca-Cola.
They did sound like the records. They didn't sound like jingles. They were not jingles, you know. We were doing many songs that were 60, 30, and 90-second.
They had some 90s in those in the radio.
Right. And
Big
they
long
came
song.
out and we produced them exactly like their recordings were being done. We used a lot of the same musicians and arrangers and the same studios. So it wasn't like Madison Avenue jingle house music, and they loved the idea of it.
It's so nice to leave the show. Cool my throat, have a cold, don't you know? Because things go better with Coca-Cola. Yeah, now things go better with Coke.
Yes, in between those sad songs, honey, Ray Charles knows things go better with Coke.
By 1969, cultural change was coming fast and furious, too fast for many.
And this was a time of turmoil when everyone was questioning everything. The government, its intentions, your parents, your friends, you know, everything that was stable at one time you were questioning that.
People were searching for stability, and they were looking for something real.
It's a real thing in the back of your mind. What you're hoping to find is a real thing.
The real thing was when I took it down to the Coca-Cola Company, it was going to be an interim campaign, then we're going to go back to things go better with Coke. I thought it was time to, because I told people at Atlanta, to represent Coca-Cola's calling card. We are the first, the real, the legitimate, everything else is an imitator. If you want to buy imitators, fine, that's up to you. You save a few pennies. But we're the real thing. And I said, we'll run it for a year. Then we'll go back to things better with Coke. But we just never did.
That's the way it is with a bottle of Coke and the way it will stay. Coca-Cola, what the world wants today. Whoa, yeah, it's a real thing. Coca-Cola is Coke.
And the best-loved variation on this theme came from an observation of Coke in the real world. In early 1971, a jetload of passengers was fogged in at an Irish airport. Among them, songwriter Bill Backer, headed to a London recording session for Coca-Cola.
And everybody got off hating each other. You know, there's different races, different colors, different creeds. And we sat around this little tiny airport, and I just watched how people began to get together over Coca-Cola and coffee. But they would sit and talk, and by the time 2 days later that the plane took off, people got on, you know, helping each other up and all. And while I was just sitting there, I just wrote that one line, I'd like to buy the world a Coke and keep it company.
After 2 days, the plane full of now friendly passengers headed for London, where Backer pitched his idea to his writing partners, Roger Cook, Roger Greenaway, and Billy Davis.
I can remember my first reaction was, yeah, I know we're selling Coca-Cola, but
That's a little far flung.
That's kind of a little bit too far.
Their song was originally supposed to be a radio spot, but it was the television version that became legendary. These never-before-seen outtakes show the first attempt at filming that spot on a hillside in Italy. Rain and other delays kept hundreds of extras waiting, and they began to get unruly.
And we had a helicopter scheduled to come at a certain time, and couldn't get them in any type of order. You just couldn't get them to get into any type of order. So the director decided, well, we're going to shoot them. This is going to be a casual hillside of kids. We're going to shoot these kids on the hillside. Well, they were hot and angry, and all of a sudden, a couple of young men started running down the hill. Harvey and I were like, no, go back, go, please go back, you know. All of a sudden, it dawned on me anyway. I don't know what Harvey was thinking. Maybe they coming to get us, you know. They stampeded down the hill. Some of them were falling over the place. Fortunately, no one got seriously hurt. We did end up calling ambulances and so forth, but it was a sight.
But my understanding is they couldn't use any of that footage much.
The footage was, couldn't use any of it. It was terrible.
Partenza playback. 1, 2,
A few days later, they tried again, on a different hilltop, with a different group of multicultural young people who had to be taught to lip sync in English.
We built a pedestal about, maybe about 10 feet high. And I climbed up on top of it and directed them and mouthed the words. We had big cards, cue cards, and they were all looking at me. That's why they all seemed to be so focused on the commercial. They were looking at me and I was directing them and mouthing, and they were looking at the cue cards.
And you were playing it too, weren't you?
Yeah, we had the speakers placed so they could hear the music as well.
I'd like to buy the world a home and furnish it with love. Grow apple trees and honey bees and snow white turtle doves. I'd like to teach the world to sing with me. Perfect harmony, perfect harmony.
Within days, letters began to pour into the Coca-Cola Company's headquarters in Atlanta. Letters from people who wanted copies of the lyrics, who wanted to know when they would be able to see it again, who just wanted to thank the Coca-Cola Company for putting out such a positive message in such a tumultuous time. Some of them weren't even Coke drinkers.
1971. You know, it's just a little bit, isn't it, like Woodstock, only a nice Woodstock. That is, it's jillions of young people on a hillside, but they're in perfect harmony. They aren't singing anti-war songs. They're not wallowing in the mud. They're not pulling their clothes off. There's something sort of wishful and wonderful about it.
And keep it company, it's the real thing. What the world wants today is the real thing. What the world wants today is the real thing.
Eventually, not one but two versions of the jingle became hit singles, with no mention of Coca-Cola.
It suggests that we as a human race do have common threads. We can get along, and we can be one.
But that kind of optimism faded quickly, as the spirit of the 60s gave way to the 70s.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
Between gas lines, inflation, and national malaise, maybe people needed to pause and refresh more than ever.
If you look back through the history of songs, it's when America is its most down that you see the need for upbeat songs. Pack up your troubles in the old kit bag, America was down. Happy Days are here again, America was down. He said, look at all the things you got to look at. We got the world's greatest music, the world's most beautiful scenery, and the world's best soft drink. It was as simple as that.
Look up, America, see what we've got. Play in the sunny side of living. Look for the best, yeah, live life refreshed. Look for the real thing, like Coca-Cola. It's the real thing.
You need any help? I just want you to know.
Of course, some Coke ads managed to exert an emotional pull even when they had nothing to do with contemporary events.
Want my Coke? It's okay, you can have it.
No.
Really, you can have it.
Of course, Mean Joe Green, one of the most popular football players of the decade, and pairing him up with this little kid, just wishing him well after a bad game, it really struck a chord. But that ad was transformed all over the world into different cultures, and different local communities had soccer players or lacrosse players in the same circumstances. Hey kid, catch, and that's how they all end.
Again, it's all focused about seeing yourself in that ad, kind of tapping you on the shoulder and saying, hey, here we are, do you want to be a part of this? And the consumer hopefully jumps in and says, you bet, I'll drink a Coke.
But America's emotional ties to Coca-Cola would be strained as never before during 80 fateful days in 1985.
What was happening in the mid-'80s was the market for sugar cola was a declining market. And so folks for the first time began to question whether or not people had actually become tired of the taste of Coca-Cola. Had we finally reached a point a century after its introduction that, maybe folks were just tired of this flavor.
The Coca-Cola Company's research and development staff went to work on that question and came up with a surprising answer. They managed to create a new cola flavor that won taste tests hands down, against not only the competition, but the original formula for Coca-Cola. Making a change seemed logical.
Well, it's very dangerous to mix logic and soft drinks together. And I've always believed in an underlying theme about Coke, that the company and its product do well when the focus is on what Coke is in. And anytime you have this pleasant soft drink presented as part of the social fabric, Coke date, a break at work, whatever it might be, that works well for Coke. When the focus turns to what's in Coke, to its ingredients, it's always trouble. When you change the formula, you attack something that has an awful lot of built-up mystique with the American people.
But in the mid-'80s, those people seemed to want something new. The fateful decision was made late in 1984. Press ahead with a top-secret program to launch a new Coke.
It wasn't something that was talked about. It had code names, secret meetings, late-night phone calls, all building up to the introduction of what we believe was the best soft drink on earth, new Coca-Cola.
The company's New York ad agency had its employees work their regular shifts, then put in after-hours work at a separate office to make sure no one knew about the change. People working on commercials for the new flavor were told it was just a new packaging design. Even the bottlers weren't let in on the secret until the day before the official public announcement. The big day, April 23, 1985, a day all Coke drinkers would long remember. The Coca-Cola Company CEO, Roberto Goizueta, broke the news at a New York City press conference.
The best soft drink, Coca-Cola, is now going to be even better. Simply stated, we have a new formula for Coke.
Then came the questions from the press.
I mean, are you 100% certain that this won't bomb, this new formula?
I think, as I said, I think this is the surest move ever, because the consumer made it. We didn't.
New Coke was launched in a confident blaze of publicity. But public reaction was immediate and negative.
All of the taste tests said people preferred the taste of this new product to the century-old product. What they hadn't factored in was the huge emotional attachment there was to this brand.
One of the things they say is they were only looking at getting people who didn't currently drink Coca-Cola to come to Coca-Cola with a change of taste. That perhaps they maybe didn't focus on the loyal drinkers and what it was going to mean to them.
But it wasn't the taste of New Coke that people didn't like. It was the idea of it, of changing a constant like Coca-Cola. By mid-May, the Coca-Cola Company's Atlanta headquarters had hired extra operators to handle the 5,000 angry calls coming in each day. By June, they were handling 8,000 a day.
Just like the soldiers in World War II wrote these love letters about the brand, the American people were astounded that we would change the formula for a product that had been part of their lives for almost a century at the time it was introduced. And they told us in no uncertain terms that we shouldn't do that. We didn't have the right to change the formula of their product.
And many of them weren't Coca-Cola drinkers. They're just American citizens who believe that something fundamental that's a part of their society has come under attack. So you can never get away from the psychology of Coke. And that's where they made their fundamental mistake, as far as I'm concerned.
By July, the company had decided that enough was enough and held another press conference.
The news about the introduction of Coca-Cola Classic ran on the Dow Jones wire at 3:18 p.m. yesterday.
I'm Don Keogh, president of the Coca-Cola Company. When we brought you the new taste of Coke, we knew that millions would prefer it, and millions do. And we knew that it would beat the taste of our major competitor, and it does. What we didn't know was how many thousands of you would phone and write asking us to bring back the classic taste of original Coca-Cola. Well, we read and we listened, and you know the rest.
Well, you know, there are a handful of conspiracy theorists who think New Coke was a deliberate marketing ploy to rekindle this sense of allegiance to the company. I don't believe that. I've always believed that what Don Keogh, then the president of the company, said was true. He said,
Some critics will say Coca-Cola has made a marketing mistake. And some cynics say that we planned the whole thing. The truth is, we're not that dumb, and we're not that smart.
I think the lesson learned from New Coke was that Coca-Cola as a brand was not owned by the Coca-Cola Company. It was a brand that the American people claim ownership of.
The American people believed that something important in their lives that was part of the fabric of society, that was like a second American flag, had been taken away from them.
And I think that Coke can do best by realizing that this brand of theirs is a part of who we are as people.
Looking back, the company could say that New Coke had been a blessing in disguise. It taught once and for all that there is an intangible link between the taste of Coke and the lives of its consumers. The continued overseas success of Coca-Cola in the years since then only proves the point. At every symbolic moment of the last 2 decades, it seems that Coke has been there. The fall of Soviet communism, and for millions in the former Eastern Bloc countries, their first taste of Coca-Cola. Space shuttles and space stations, where Coke became the first soda in orbit. Scenes in the Persian Gulf that seemed to echo the Second World War. The Coca-Cola Company likes to convey its success in amazing statistics, numbers that PR people used to call gee whizzards. If all the Coca-Cola ever made were put into a 6-foot deep swimming pool, the pool would be more than 25 miles long and hold 643 million people. If it were to erupt from Old Faithful, it would flow for more than 1,979 years. If it were put into 8-ounce bottles, it would make a 4-lane highway encircling the world 96 times. Sold in nearly 200 countries, more than 1 billion drinks per day. The numbers roll on and on. But numbers only hint at what Coca-Cola has really come to stand for. John Pemberton created it. Asa Candler believed it could become America's drink. Robert Woodruff saw how it could become successful around the world. Thousands of Americans reacted with genuine emotion when the company tried to change it. It's become a link to the past that looks toward the future.
And especially in today's environment where everything seems to be changing on them, all of a sudden you can still have a Coke and you know exactly how that's going to taste and you know exactly where you can get it, and it's going to refresh you the same as it did whether it was 10 days ago or 10 years ago.
Certainly to Andy Warhol, the best thing about Coke was that yours was just like Elizabeth Taylor's and that all Cokes are alike. There is a democracy about this drink, and it's also quite different from, let's say, a rare vintage wine that you have to be extremely rich to own. It's different from something that's only available in a given region because it's global and it's going to be the same everywhere.
And all you have to do is be in a foreign country and see a Coke sign, a country where you didn't speak the language and didn't know anyone, and you saw a Coca-Cola sign or a store that sold Coca-Cola, you felt better instantly.
It's what you want it to be. And you and I can talk and pause over a Coke, and it's something that's universal. Let's have a Coke.
We've talked about the fact that on a daily basis, people have to consume about 64 ounces of liquid, and that on a global basis, we represent about an ounce of that. So there's a lot of growth still ahead of us, and our belief, just like the belief of Robert Woodruff, is that if you provide the proper distribution, you provide the proper motivation, people will drink Coca-Cola.
Things go better with Coca-Cola. Things go better with Coke. Life is much more fun when you're refreshed. And Coke refreshes you best. It's the refreshin'est.
You're getting thirsty. Very thirsty. You and your thirst. Now, go to the store. Get lots of Coca-Cola. Quench your thirst. Disregard all other soft drink advertising and drink only Coca-Cola. Always Coca-Cola.
Yeah, this is Dottie. Connie Hansen. Who's this? Donya Williams from Mission High School, yeah. Well, you want to know what to serve at your graduation party? Oh, that's easy, Donya. Are you watching High Time right now? You are? Okay, hang up and I'll show you. Well, now, if you're having a graduation party or maybe a senior picnic or a farewell party and you're looking for the really, really right thing to serve, this is it. Coca-Cola in the new family size. Because this is the same delicious Coca-Cola that we've all enjoyed for years, only there's lots more of it. It has the same quality, it has the same bright, bracing flavor, and it comes in a beautiful bottle that you can be proud to serve on any table, formal or informal. You know, I think you young hostesses are just like your mothers. You appreciate quality. Well, almost everyone appreciates the best, and the best is Coca-Cola.